Hello and welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, Making Education Work Across the Globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and my partner in crime, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, are you well?
Yeah, very good. Good to see you. Looking forward to this.
Oh, I'm absolutely delighted because I get to introduce one of my absolute heroes of early career and basically everything to do with education. Because tonight we're going to be talking to Professor Sam Twiselton, OBE, about all things early career, mentoring, training, development. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome her here. So welcome, Sam.
Great to be here. Lovely to see you all.
Okay, so Sam, we're thrilled to have you. Now, you're one of these people that every time there's a kind of, I don't know, a wise person needed, like a voice of wisdom in the field of teacher development, you're someone whose name comes up all the time. And you're kind of well known amongst people who know who you are. But for people who may not know who you are, give us a sense of what your role is and kind of why you're one of these people that people ask all the time to do stuff to do with teacher development.
Well, I certainly can't tell you why anybody thinks I'm wise, but anyway, my day job is I'm director of Sheffield Institute of Education at Sheffield Hallam University. The Institute of Education is the bit that does all things to do with teacher development, teacher research, wider school workforce, all that kind of thing, lots of research, lots of degrees and so on. But I'm probably more known for the external stuff that I do. There's a whole range of different things. I'm the Vice President of the Charter College of Teaching. And as you said, I'm kind of associated with lots of things to do with teacher development. And for one reason or another, in recent years, I seem to have ended up on loads of advisory groups for DFE and Ofsted and people like that. And particularly, I suppose it really started with the CARSH review of initial teacher training back in 2014, and then a whole load of things that followed from that to do with teacher recruitment, teacher retention, leading to things like the early career framework and the ITT core content framework, and now the ITT market review. But I did actually start my career as a primary school teacher, so I know what it's like to be in the classroom, even though it was quite a long time ago now. And I'm just very passionate about the importance of teachers. Teachers are the most important people in the world, because you couldn't have all the other things that we depend on, like, the petrol that we were just talking about, everybody being short of. You couldn't have any of those things without that bedrock of education, which you couldn't have without brilliant teachers. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, and so so I suppose the first thing I want to, you're invited to take part in a process to develop this early career framework. So how did that come about? So were you approached to do that? Or how did that even come about? Because it's an amazing piece of work. We want to talk about that in more detail, but how did it come to be that you're so closely associated with that?
So weirdly, you've picked on the one thing that I am completely associated with, but that I wasn't actually directly involved in developing. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So I sit on the advisory group for the teacher recruitment and retention strategy, which was set up. It's a really good piece of work that DFE did when it finally agreed there is a problem with teacher recruitment and retention, having been in denial for a long time. And it was a multifaceted, well, it's ongoing, the group still meets, the work still carries on. It's a multifaceted thing. But one of the things it gave birth to was the early career framework. Now, there was a group that was set up to oversee that, but I wasn't part of that. I had lots of informal discussions with people on that group, people like Marie Hamer at Ambition and so on, but I wasn't actually technically on that group. So it's weird how people always ask me about it. But I am on the recruitment and retention strategy group. And obviously I watched what happened with the early career framework with great interest, because I thought it was a really excellent part of the strategy, because it's probably the most important thing from my time on the Carter Review, is realising we're expecting too much of our new teachers when they've had such a short time in their initial teacher training. And we expect them to sort of be the fully formed product and hit the ground running. And that's just not realistic. And that's one of the reasons why so many do leave the profession so early. There's a lot of research that shows that. So that was great, and I just supported that from a distance. But then through being on the recruitment and retention group, I got into discussions about what we're doing about ITT then. If we're going to get the maximum benefit from the early career framework, which is a 2-year programme to support teachers once they've qualified in the first 2 years, it's now a legal entitlement. everybody should get it working in a state school, to support them for the first 2 years. But because my world is mainly ITT, my sort of discussion on the group was, what are we doing about ITT? How are we going to maximise the potential benefit you get from joining up ITT to that additional 2 years that we've now got as a legal entitlement? And as a result of that, they decided that they would develop the thing called the core content framework, which is something that really sort of velcros on to the early career framework. It is a framework, it's not a curriculum, it's just a minimum entitlement, laying out the things that should be covered in ITT that map directly onto what then should be covered in a more sophisticated way, a sort of higher level in the early career framework, so that between them, the two join up to create, a minimum of 3 years. I mean, obviously longer if you've done a longer initial teacher training, and possibly some people carry on after the ECF as well. But for everybody, at least, a minimum entitlement of 3 years, hopefully very high quality, ongoing support and development with mentoring and coaching right at the heart, both in the ITT bit and in the early career framework bit. Early career framework bit. So I chaired the advisory group for the core content framework. So that was a couple of years ago. That came in this time last year as a statutory thing that all ITT providers have to do. The point being that it means that all people entering the profession now, having been through ITT last year, have had it, which means that they should therefore hopefully maximise the benefit they get from the early career framework, which is now kicking in for everybody. And
well,
then,
fantastic. So
sorry,
you've helped
long answer.
weave it all together, which is fantastic. And so now we have this. So Emma, so you're championing the bit there because this is like your core work.
This is my bread and butter. I'm kind of on the receiving end of it.
So what?
Share with colleagues.
Got these hard questions for Sam now.
I really wanted to ask, because there's a lot of kind of documents flying around, and there's lots of kind of talk about what should or shouldn't be in the ITT core content framework or the ECF. But I just wanted to kind of get your view on what do you hope that having those two documents being implemented in schools and training providers will achieve? What's kind of if you could have a dream of what you wanted for that early career experience to look like, and of the impact of that to be, what in Sam Twiselton's world, what does that look like?
I mean, there's so many different ways to answer that question. I think we're already seeing one of the things that I hoped for beginning to happen, which is a real change in the narrative around early career teachers. So like I said, we saw with the Carter Review, we spoke to loads of NQTs everywhere we went, as well as talking to the training providers. We talked to people who'd been through that training. So we talked to what were then called NQTs and RQTs for each of those providers. And the number of them that were already, and this was like this time of the year, sort of September, October, already really stressed about the level of expectation on them, and the fact that they had to pretend like they were experts when they knew they weren't, and that imposter syndrome sort of thing. And it felt like schools were just expecting so much of them. Understandable reasons, accountability, high stakes, and all the rest of it. But it was already making them think they wanted to leave as early as this in the year. And I feel like because the early career framework has been talked about quite a lot by people like you, Emma, in its lead up to now finally being implemented as a national entitlement, we're all talking about it. We're all talking about early career teachers, and we're all recognising what is absolutely nobody ever quarrels with the position that I just articulated, that we expect too much of them. Everybody agrees that's a problem. So hopefully it's now beginning not to be a problem. And I think actually, weirdly, the pandemic has helped with that, because obviously people had their training really disrupted both this year and last year. So again, it brought to the fore, what can we realistically expect of people who've had this disrupted training? And anyway, what can we realistically expect of them anyway? So it's changed the narrative. So that in itself is a brilliant thing, even if that was the only thing that happened. But obviously what we hope is that ITT and the early career framework experience between them will add up to something that's really supportive, really developmental, helps them to feel like it's okay to continue to be learning, and gives it, really importantly, quite a lot of status and hopefully a lot of value to the role of the mentor, which has always been there, both in ITT and at least in the first year after you've qualified. But often it's a bit of a dog's body role, sometimes given to the person who just happened to have time, sometimes given to people who haven't quite got enough experience.
As well as changing the narrative, and like I said, that's a great thing in itself. What I really hope is we've created a really high quality experience for the trainees and then the early career teachers through the combination of those two frameworks. But really importantly, it's put the mentor right at the centre of that. We've always known that's a really important role. Often it's the make or break in ITT, and I think probably could be in early career teachers as well. So it's always sort of been understood it's an important role, but hasn't necessarily actively been given the value that it should. And I think certainly the ECF, I think we're seeing that happening now. It comes with, with some challenges in terms of the amount of time that needs to be devoted to it, but that's right, it should be. And it needs to be well-trained people who have status, who have value in the school, who are performing that role.
Well, you'll be very pleased, Sam, because I was delivering the mentor training framework only the other day using your materials.
Excellent, brilliant.
It was like you say, it was a real shift in terms of the mentor for NQTs in some settings used to just be somebody who showed you how to use the photocopier or which reading scheme books you were using, or agreed with you that Martin from Humanities was a pain in the bum. That was what it was. Whereas now the materials and the expectations of the mentors are absolutely huge. And we interviewed Hailey Hughes the other week about her book, Mentoring in Schools, and about how this role in schools, in mentoring, it's that kind of golden narrative now, isn't it? Because it goes through all the new national professional qualifications. It's a real route now for teacher development, isn't it? To rather than have to go from classroom to leadership, there's this real focus on development of mentoring skills, which links beautifully, Tom, with your work around instructional coaching as well.
Absolutely.
Well, it does. The thing that I'm interested in is in a way, I mean, I think what's clear, and what you're saying is right, is that the narrative has changed, and this is a process. That we've got the system, we've got mentoring being developed, and of course, everyone needs to be developed. Mentors need to be developed, coaches need to be developed, people training the mentors need to be developed. But I'm interested in how sort of many variables there are. Then there's still this sort of risk and reality that a set of core ideas get disseminated, and kind of interpreted 100 ways, and then just yesterday or the day before yesterday, I reread Dylan Williams' Inside the Black Box paper, where he is there saying, like, back in 1998, that the thing that really is going to make the big difference to raising standards in our system is if teachers really understand about formative assessment, including things like checking for understanding and asking questions, so they're not assuming the keen volunteers represent the rest. And he points out that in a lot of classrooms, the teacher isn't really aware of the level of understanding of the majority of the children. And that is still something I see every single time I go to a school. And it's like, and he's saying, look, the argument is this: formative assessment works. Yes, we can improve it and it will make a big impact. So that's the focus. Now, do you think that this whole system that we've set up now then with the common framework of ITT and then the ECF is going to sort of solve that kind of core feature of teaching and deliver on that?
I mean, that's definitely what it's set up to do. But it's also another way it's a bit controversial, because it's actually been set up in a very directed kind of way. Speaking as a partner in one of the deliverers of the ECF, both in its pilot and now in its national rollout, we were very, very managed to make sure that our materials conform to a certain kind of model. And now I think the providers are being very managed to make sure they're delivered in a certain kind of way. And I think, to be fair to the DFE, they're trying to address exactly the problem that you've just articulated there, Tom, in that they're trying to be much more clear, much more directive. I think in education we can be a bit woolly sometimes in how we try and support people. So it's a lot of warm, words of the kind that you were talking about, Emma, but isn't necessarily helping you to know what to actually do. What's the actionable point there? But that does translate into something that looks quite directive, and it can look a bit formulaic if you're not careful. And I worry if that's what it becomes, if it becomes a formula that we believe you just follow this and you'll get the answer, then because of all those variables that you talked about, Tom, it actually probably won't. So we'll lull ourselves into a false sense of security that we just follow this way of doing things, this method, and all the children should be learning perfectly, or the trainees should be learning perfectly, or early career teachers should be learning perfectly, and it won't do. So I'm sounding like a bit of a woolly academic now, in that I've got a lot of sympathy for this directive mandated way of doing things, because I think we have, I think that the black box is a really good example, some really brilliant stuff there. But what did it translate into? A load of woolly stuff around APP that actually just people tied themselves in knots over, and it ended up with a load of bureaucratic nonsense rather than really powerful pedagogy.
So it's that fidelity of the ideas. This is my worry, that people over worry about the constraints, because the freedoms are kind of like, every time you put an idea to someone, it goes pooh. It's just like, and you actually have to do quite a lot of effort to just say, no, come on, this is the idea, not that one. This is it, and this is what's been studied and shown. So keep to it. Are resistant to that, aren't they?
Yeah. So for me, the answer is recognizing that idea does come with some caveats and a qualification around it because of all the variables. So it's not the answer, but it's a clear, actionable thing that you should be trying to get good at. And then maybe that'll give you enough of a firm foundation that you can begin to flex from it or challenge it or whatever. But I think what we have done in the past in ITE is we've tied ourselves up in knots so much with all those variables, with all the uncertainty, that the poor trainees or the early career teachers end up with no action that they're clear that they need to go and do. So, what I do like about these frameworks and the specificity of them and the mentor training and so on that accompanies is it translates into action, into things that you can go and try again, keep getting better at, and then hopefully develop the mental models, which then gives you the foundation from which you can then start to acknowledge the greater complexity that is there, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And it's very directed, Tom. It's almost scripted in what you have to say, but there is still, like Sam says, a little bit of flex in there to adapt it to your local delivery model. So, and by that I don't mean this is the way we do it here, as in, whether you're working in primary or secondary or special or whatever part of the sector, serving a particular or whatever. You can adapt it, but it is so much more focused on action in the classroom, as in it's very deliberate in the way that you even structure the mentor meetings, and you have to have that focus on what this looks like in the classroom in terms of teaching and learning. Gone are the days of kind of chewing the fat around things, which is still important. It's an important part of developing that professional conversation about wider issues, but actually the framework itself is so focused on what you do in the classroom and securing really, really powerful kind of teaching and learning. It's a massive shift for many people. And I think that's why it sits quite uncomfortably for some people, because it can feel
I'll ask
really
you a question, because this is one of my questions I want to ask you, because I pick this up on Twitter all the time, and people who work in teacher training sometimes get very kind of distressed about the notion that they are training people. They are actually, in their mind, educating them, and they're very particular in saying it's ITE and not ITT. We're here to educate people so they can be good teachers, which means they should be able to think, debate, challenge, question, evaluate ideas. And then there's this counter argument, which is, I want them to be able to survive the first year and not be burned alive by their year nines. And you know what? They'll have plenty of time to evaluate, but let's just get them functioning up front first. And so do you see that? I see that tension played out in discussions, but what's your view of that?
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be either or, really, should it? And which I think is what you're saying. But I absolutely, if I'm going to the doctors and I'm having an injection, I want to know that doctor or that nurse, or whoever it is, knows how to do it, so that they're not going to, sever my artery. I want to know that there's a technique that they have practiced and that they understand, and so on. And and that there are elements of that in teaching that our children and their parents have a right to know that they're in that, got that level of sort of assurance. And like you say, to survive as a early career teacher, you've got to feel like you know how to do these things. So there is a training element, absolutely, just like there is for doctors, like there is for lawyers. It's not some kind of low level thing. But of course, you want them to be thinking, questioning, critically reflective people. We know that's ultimately what turns you from an average teacher into a brilliant teacher. But that doesn't mean that's all you do. And I think there is a danger sometimes in the rhetoric around ITE that all you need to do is help people be really critically reflective, and that will turn them into great practitioners. And I think you actually do need both. And sensible people often talk about training and education. I mean, to be honest, I'm so sick of the debate, I don't even get involved in it anymore because it's just.
I really like that kind of sliding scale you've got, where you talk about where people go from not novice to expert. You've got some really neat descriptions of that movement, which if people haven't heard it, I would love to hear you describe it again, about that kind of those stages that people go through as teachers.
Yeah, so that's based on my own research, where it was just by gathering data from trainees at different points in their courses, particularly based on observing them teaching in school. The methodology was such that what you're trying to do is kind of unpick their thinking during the lesson that had been observed, in terms of what they were really trying to achieve. And it was just so clear, and it's kind of like really obvious, really. But people, right, very early on in their training, and particularly early on in the placement, maybe with a new class or whatever, all they could think about was behaviour and organisation. And just getting through to the end of that lesson, feeling like the organisation had worked and that the children had done as they were told, and you got something finished by the end of it. That's, they weren't, that just took up all their kind of active, conscious thinking, because that was dominating their thoughts. They weren't really thinking about learning. They were just trying to get that stuff done. And absolutely, we can all remember, can't we? I'd still be like that if you threw me in front of a class I didn't know now. I'd just be desperate to get to the end of the lesson with the children not completely going wild, because that dominates your thoughts until you've got those strategies embedded and in place. And then the next stage of development that the data suggested they went through was they would start to think about learning once they're kind of less obsessed by the behaviour and they felt they got some strategies in place for that. They would start to think about learning, but in a fairly limited, constricted sort of way, where it was kind of following somebody else's plan, and success for them was really just following that plan and ticking off the things that were on it. And they hadn't really thought about learning in a kind of bigger picture, more conceptual way, so couldn't really answer the questions around, so why were the children learning that particular thing on that particular day? The answer was always, well, it's in the scheme or it's in the plan, and they hadn't thought beyond that, which contrasted with the final category, which was the concept skill builders, who had just thought about what they were trying to do much more conceptually. So this is what I want the children to learn in a way that they will remember it and be able to apply it in the future. So a much more sophisticated kind of concept of learning, which was that sort of transforming understanding. And they were usually the most self-critical because what they were trying to do was just so much harder, so they usually thought they hadn't been successful. But actually, you could see in their practice, the fact that they were thinking in that way tended to mean that they were actually much more kind of sophisticated in the range of strategies that they were using with the children to do exactly what Dylan William was talking about, checking, have they really understood this? Can they apply it in this different way that I've just suggested? How will I know they'll remember it tomorrow? Or even just checking what they remembered from the last time. Just that bigger picture, sort of connecting it up over time.
That is such an interesting framework for thinking about that. And I think we all recognise that. I mean, I recognise that about myself, but in a slightly different way. I feel like when I first started teaching, I was just teaching A-level physics and maths, which I felt quite good at, and behaviour was an issue. So I thought, I know my stuff. Then I went to comprehensive schools and I thought, oh gosh, behaviour management's a thing. And then later on, I started teaching more sort of lower attaining groups of students who were doing maths and science, having not found it easy. and realizing I didn't even know how to explain the science anymore. So like getting more and more aware of just how hard it is. So rather than feeling ever more confident, I feel like over my career I got less and less sure of myself because you're more aware of all the challenges and that kind of thing.
Definitely,
so it's endlessly fascinating. And then you've got the individual personalities of teachers and their self-image and all that. I just think it's so interesting, this whole world. And then there's this sort of government agenda, which is an important one. But it's linking this sort of question, which is, it gets debated just anyway. And then to me, it feels like out of nowhere, this bomb has been dropped of, we're going to review every single provider of initial teacher education. And we're going to have a review of the market of providers. And that's caused an enormous thought in England because of how kind of defensive people are, but also, I don't know, there's strong views, aren't there? So I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but can you capture somehow what the argument's about? You know, why are people so worried or bothered or feel so strongly about it?
Well, I think the whole reaccreditation thing is the biggest driver there. Is you're having to apply for your own job, so that immediately puts everybody defensive, including myself. I mean, we're a provider here as well. So that frames the whole rest of the discussion. So that, that obviously is not a brilliant starting point. But then I think, opinions are very different. There are some very loud voices, particularly in the Russell Group universities, have a real worry about their academic freedom. They say it's a really important part of being a university that nobody tells us how to do things. Our approach as a university is to create our own curriculum, which is critical, that is flexible, that sort of reflects the sort of high performance of our students. And we don't like being dictated to in terms of curriculum. Now, actually, ironically, the proposals, what has been consulted on over the summer, don't dictate a curriculum. They do say you've got to follow the core content framework, but that was already in place. We're a year into that. I think probably you have to bring that dictating a curriculum fear together with the fear of having to reapply for your own job. And I think what providers, and I really understand where they're coming from, are worried that only a certain kind of curriculum will get through. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be, particularly as what that curriculum looks like, other than it's got to follow a very broad framework in the form of the core content framework. It hasn't been stipulated. So is there a hidden curriculum that's the right curriculum that is the one that probably universities don't want to do because I feel like it's very, very formulaic. But we don't even know that because it's not being stated. It's just that we'll find out that our curriculum isn't the right one when we get sort of turned away through this accreditation process. I think there's also a worry that, who is it in the government that is a real expert in this stuff? So, are we actually going to have people who aren't really, civil servants, not experts, and have never trained teachers?
And what's the curriculum of the thing? So you've got the core content framework. So there's some basic things, but I mean, I'm trying to think of something which, if you're delivering the core content and building towards the early career framework in a reasonable way, and that's already there, and it's only been going for a while, so we haven't had time to really see how well that's going. What sorts of things might a university-based PGCE, say, be delivering, which is sort of likely to sort of be deemed inappropriate? I'm trying to think of what that is,
I don't think there is, to be honest. I mean, we were really clear in the group that I chaired for the core content framework. We spent longer writing the introduction, even though we knew nobody would read it, than we did on the actual framework, because it was so important in that introduction to say all the things that it wasn't, and the fact it doesn't include lots of things that you might expect to see in ITE. So because it came from the early career framework, it was a working back from the early career framework. So it didn't include a whole load of foundational things and things that would reflect the particular context. So, Emma talked about the phase and the subject, they're generic frameworks, and yet we would expect trainee teachers to be taught within a phase, within a subject. And then, of course, within a context of, so the skit that we work with in Tower Hamlets will have a different flavour to its curriculum to the one that we work with on the east coast of Yorkshire and the Yorkshire Riding. So all of that you would expect to see as additional and, wonderful in its richness and its sort of breadth and depth to what you see in what are fairly minimum frameworks. I don't think there's anything in the frameworks to object to. Others do. They don't like their focus on cognitive science. I think it's there in a way that's completely reasonable. Of course, we should have some input on that. It doesn't dominate them in the way that some people think it does. I don't.
That's the sort of thing where that I start getting triggered then, because to me it's like saying.
I saw you flinch.
People are so weird about this. Like cognitive science is like saying I don't know. It's like talking about training doctors without thinking about biology. How we learn is the science of how we learn. You can't. How could you not? I mean, obviously, then what they really mean is very narrowly mandated actions you must all do every lesson, like a quiz.
Yeah.
I get that, but that's not what cognitive science is. No, it's like
exactly, and it's not framed in the framework as being you've got to do a quiz. It isn't. Yeah. Anyway,
do you know what you said about the taking ages to write the foreword, but it's a bit like the purpose and aims in the national curriculum, isn't it? Nobody ever looks at that bit. Nobody ever reads that bit. They just jump straight to the learning objectives or the overview of the unit, and they don't actually then have that framed by what came first. It's almost like the same crazy logic has been applied to the core content framework as most people deal with the national curriculum. If you actually read the purpose and aims of the national curriculum for each subject, some of them are really beautiful. But because we then jump to, you've got to do this particular objective and that particular objective, it doesn't sound as broad and full of possibility as the actual purpose of it. So it's really interesting to hear you say that you spend ages on the introduction that nobody reads.
Well, I mean, usually we don't, and I'm as bad as anybody for jumping straight. For a profession that talks about not wanting formulas, you leap to the bit that's going to give you the formula that tells you what to do. And the rest.
I kind of thinking that, everyone has biases, and my bias says that I feel two things. One of them is universities ought to kind of respect their kind of role within a wider system, and that there's a democratic aspect to that, and that governments are entitled to kind of say, let's get teacher training sorted out, and we're part of that, and not feel they're sort of aloof from it. At the same time, I feel like an education system which some universities felt they no longer wanted to be part of because they felt would be a poorer system. So it's all about dialogue and timing and consensus building.
Yeah.
There's a whole approach to it. The idea that, say, Cambridge is sort of rattling the drum saying, we might not be interested if that's what you make us do. I just feel like, why would you engineer policy where that might be an outcome? That doesn't sound like a very healthy way forward.
No, exactly. I think the intent is a good one. It's about trying to join up all these different bits of the system in the way that, we started this conversation. The way it's been done it's unfortunate. I don't really know why it had to be the way it is. And, I find it difficult being associated with it because often they talk about these are the proposals of the expert group. Well, it was never my proposal that we do it in this way, even though I absolutely see the sort of the value of the intent. And I still think it is possible that we could bring about some big improvements through this process. But you can't bring them about if you don't bring enough of the people with you, and at the moment it feels like we're losing the battle a little bit. So I'm hoping that, well, one of the things I've argued very strongly for is we need more time to implement this, whatever comes out as the government response to this review. And I think that battle might be being won. And then that time needs to be used to have a much more constructive dialogue. So that we feel like we're doing this together rather than it being done to. I think that's why people are so defensive. They feel completely done to, and we all know what that feels like.
Yeah, it's horrible. What's your sense of it, Emma?
The review? I'm kind of in the thing. There's nothing.
Get it out.
I can kind of see both sides of it, really. I mean, we're a skit that we work with, so and we do work with a university to deliver part of our courses. So I can kind of see both sides of it, but I just think that teaching is both the science and the art. Where, you know, you do need that kind of academic rigor to it, but you also need the practicalities of this is how you do it on the ground. And I think that potentially, if you're an institution or a group or a course that's taken a very hard line on just one of those aspects of it, then that's where you become unhappy about being asked to look at it from both sides. And I think I'm very lucky we come at it from kind of from both angles, really. But I can see why some people feel quite aggrieved, because some of the reading, and there's nothing wrong with the reading lists that go with the core content framework or the early career framework. But I think some people feel, like anything, that there are things missing that form a core part of their work. And I think that's where a lot of but they're misinterpreting it, that we can't ever do this, our favourite bit of this. It's actually you need to, and you can put your other bits on there. But I think that's potentially the message that some people have misread, that you can only do this, rather than it being a core which you can add to.
It's a minimum entitlement, that's all it is. You should be doing more. I mean, it's ironic that, you know, you say you feel like in a skit, and I'm a massive fan of skits. I think they're a great thing. You know, you're able to sort of see both sides. But ironically, another worry I have about the review is it might be harder to stay in the market as a skit. The threat is probably bigger to small skits than it is to universities, and yet they're not the ones making the noise, really.
That's so interesting. So it feels like, you know, there's a very big solution to a problem, which, I mean, is there. There are a few things I do think that this conversation is important, and I wish we didn't have such sort of camp-forming tendencies in some of the debates, because it does get very polarised, and naturally, you know, people are on the defensive. They are, you know, feeling threatened, and that's not healthy. But I feel like there is a kind of an inherent issue, which is that ITE is all about setting people off. But then once they're out into the world, you don't really have much control over that. You know, they go into a different department and a different school and a different year group with a different set of colleagues. And there's so many variables in there, which you've got to keep motivating those teachers. And so you can't even sort of demonstrate that a teacher has picked things up. And, you know, 5 years down the line, you know, that it's probably, you could say, well, did they get a good preparation? And teachers will be able to report that. But then people get all sort of anecdotal. So it's difficult. But I do think, I have to say, I will have to wrap up in a minute, but I have to say, whenever I know that you're involved, or at least sort of there are, people do listen to you, don't they? I mean, I think that is important. And you do have you have some clout.
Sometimes on a good day, I feel like I have.
But I think you do, don't you? I mean, do you feel like a kind of responsibility there? Do you feel like that's a pressure, or like, do you enjoy it?
Yeah, I really feel the responsibility of this, because people's jobs are depending on it. You might have seen in Schools Week and the TES when the consultation was launched, there was a little bit of a backstory that they picked up on, in that I was allowed to publicly express my worries about the implementation, and that's part of the deal there. How they kept my name on that report, because I was going to take it off at one point, was for me to carry on having a voice in how they do the implementation. But now, of course, I feel pressure of that, because, you know, that's quite fraught as well. So sometimes I'm
you just, I know. Well, we're all rooting for you, and I feel like, you know, Emma and I do the same, supporting teacher development. I spent all day today doing teacher training, and the discussions you have are just absolutely wonderful. I love it, and I do think it's a wonderful role that we've managed to craft ourselves into. So we're lucky, aren't we? I feel, and you know, it's great that you're there and we can communicate in this way. So thank you so much for your time today, and
very well.
We'll be keeping our eyes and our ears open for how it all pans out. And I hope maybe in a year's time or something, we'll come back and talk to you again and say, right, what's happened with that whole thing? But Sam, thank you so much for your time. It's been really great to talk to you. And I think you're a really inspirational person. We're lucky to have you in our system. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Thanks for everything. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And on behalf of everybody who works in initial teacher education or training, whichever you want to call it, thank you. Yours is the voice of wisdom and sense a lot of the time. And it's like Tom says, it's just great to see your name on things. So thank you for rooting for this kind of part of the profession. It's very much appreciated. And thank you for coming on tonight.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, that's Mind the Gap, making education work across the globe with me, Tom Sherrington, and Emma Turner. We'll see you again with our next episode. And thanks again to Sam Twiselton for joining us for this episode. Thanks and goodbye.